I'm Josh Ryan, licensed professional counselor, and this is Pause and Respond, the framework for emotional control, disciplined thinking, and better decisions under pressure. Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling emotionally exhausted? Even though nothing about that conversation was actually yours to fix, someone else was angry, someone else was disappointed, or maybe they were overwhelmed, and somehow you ended up carrying it home. Their frustration became your anxiety. Their silence became your responsibility. And their bad day quietly became your burden. It's remarkable how many of us spend our lives carrying emotional weight that never belonged to us in the first place. Somewhere along the way, many of us quietly began believing something we never consciously chose to believe. And that's that if they're okay, somehow we're okay. We didn't learn it from a book. No one sat us down and explained it. Life just taught it to us. One conversation at a time, one relationship after relationship. Until one day, it no longer felt like a belief. It simply felt like reality. Children are remarkable observers. Long before they understand relationships, they're learning the emotional rules of the homes they grow up in. Some children quietly learned, stay quiet. Others learned, work harder. Some children become the comedian, others the achiever, and some even learn to become invisible. But some become emotionally responsible. They learn to read the emotional temperature of a room before they even know who they are. They learn to notice tension before anyone says a word. They become experts at anticipating disappointment. And that's not because they're unusually mature. It's because adaptation is one of the most remarkable things children know how to do. And what begins as adaptation slowly becomes identity. You don't simply become someone who notices other people's emotions. You become someone who believes it's your job to manage them. And that's a very different thing. Children often become emotionally responsible long before they themselves become emotionally secure. And that may be one of the saddest realities we encounter in counseling. Not because anyone intentionally intended harm, but because children naturally assume responsibility for environments they never had the power to control. Over time, though, that adaptation, it quietly follows you into adulthood. You become a peacemaker, the fixer. Maybe you're called the dependable one, or the person everyone calls. The one who always knows how to calm the room. The first to apologize. The one who carries more than anyone realizes from the outside. Now, some people may admire your compassion, while inside, you're exhausted. Because there's a difference between caring for people and carrying people. Most of us were never taught that difference. Now, here's what I've come to believe. Many people don't carry everyone else's emotions because they're simply compassionate. They carry them because somewhere deep inside, they've connected being needed with being valuable. And that's a completely different conversation. If usefulness became the safest way to belong, then usefulness slowly became part of your identity. You stopped asking the question, who am I? And you quietly started asking, who needs me? Many of us without even realizing it. Your worth became connected to your usefulness. That's why saying no feels so uncomfortable. That's why someone else's disappointment can feel almost unbearable. That's why boundaries create guilt instead of peace. Because if your identity has been built around keeping everyone else emotionally okay, their disappointment doesn't simply feel uncomfortable. It feels like you're losing a part of yourself. Now, one of the biggest misunderstandings I see is this. People often believe they're being compassionate, when what they're actually doing is something very different. Sometimes what feels like compassion is anxiety wearing compassionate clothes. Think about that again. All right. Sometimes what feels like compassion is wearing anxiety's compassionate clothing. You're not constantly scanning everyone's emotion because you're unusually loving. Sometimes you're scanning everyone's emotions because your nervous system learned that safety depended on noticing them first. That's not a weakness, that's adaptation. But what once protected you may now be exhausting you. Now, I've sat with people who apologize before anyone blamed them. Not because they've done something wrong, but because somewhere inside, they learned that taking responsibility quickly made relationships feel safer. I've watched people carry guilt that wasn't theirs, conflict that wasn't theirs, expectations that they had never set. Not because they lacked confidence, but because their nervous system quietly believed, if I can keep everyone else okay, maybe I'll still belong. Now that belief makes perfect sense until you realize how heavy it is to carry. And this is where one simple distinction changes everything. To care is healthy. To carry is heavy. Care says, I'll sit with you. Carry says, I'll suffer for you. Care says, I'm here. Carry says, your emotional world is now my responsibility. And those are not the same thing. One creates connection. The other quietly creates exhaustion. And eventually that exhaustion leads into resentment. Think about the people you love most. How often do their emotions quietly determine yours? How often does someone else's disappointment become your anxiety? Someone else's frustration become your responsibility, or their silence becomes your self-doubt? How often have you worked harder to regulate another person's emotions than to even begin to understand your own? That's a heavy way to live. And for many people, it's become so normal, they no longer recognize the weight that they're carrying. Now, this episode isn't about caring less. It's not about becoming emotionally distant. It's not about protecting yourself by building walls. It's simply about discovering something healthier. You can love someone deeply without carrying what belongs to them. In fact, that's often the healthiest love you'll ever offer. Because the strongest relationships aren't built because one person carries everything. They're built because two people learn to carry what's theirs and then lovingly walk beside each other with the rest. And that leads us to one of the most important questions we'll explore today. When did caring quietly become carrying? Because somewhere between those two, many of us stopped believing we were valuable simply because we existed. And we started believing we were valuable because we were useful. And if that's true, then understanding why we built that belief may be one of the most freeing discoveries we'll ever make. One of the questions I find myself asking clients over and over again is surprisingly simple. When did you decide this was your job? Not your career, not your title, but your emotional job. When did you begin believing that keeping everyone else emotionally steady was somehow your responsibility? Now, most people can't answer that question. And it's not because they're hiding something. It's because they never made the decision consciously. It happened quietly, one conversation, one relationship at a time. Until eventually, it stopped feeling like something you learned and it started feeling like who you were. Now, I don't believe most people wake up one morning and decide, I'm going to spend the rest of my life carrying everyone else's emotions. I think something much quieter occurs. Somewhere along the way, many of us stopped believing we were valuable simply because we existed. We were slowly believing we were valuable because we were useful. And that belief rarely arrives all at once. It grows. It grows quietly, almost invisibly, until one day it becomes the lens through which we see ourselves. Children don't decide who they are. They discover who they need to become. If staying quiet keeps the family peaceful, they become quiet. If achievement earns attention, they become achievers. If making everyone laugh reduces tension, they become entertainers. And if fixing conflict can create safety, they become fixers. Children don't choose identities. They inherit adaptations. That's one of the most important things I've learned in counseling. Children are incredibly resilient, but they're also incredibly observant. Long before they understand relationships, they're studying survival. And the problem isn't adaptation. The problem is forgetting it was an adaptation. Eventually, what's helped you survive begins introducing itself as your personality. You stop saying, this is what I learned to do, and you start saying, this is just who I am. And that's where identity quietly takes shape. I've sat with clients and asked a question that seems relatively simple. And that question is simply, what do you enjoy? And more than once, the room became completely silent. Not because the individual didn't have any interest, but because they'd spent 20 years becoming experts on everyone else's. They knew what their spouse needed, what their children needed, what their parents needed, what their coworkers needed. But somewhere along the way, their own inner world had become unfamiliar. That's what happens when you're constantly carrying borrowed weight. Eventually, you know everyone else's emotional landscape better than you know your own. Performance feels predictable. Love doesn't. Performance says, if I do enough, I'll belong. Love quietly asks, will I still belong if I don't? Performance can be measured. You always know whether you've succeeded, whether you've fixed enough, helped enough, given enough. Love requires something much more uncomfortable, and that's trust. And that's why usefulness often feels safer than vulnerability. Without realizing it, many of us begin living by invisible contracts no one ever signed. Something like, if I take care of everyone, they won't leave. If I never become a burden, I'll always belong. If I'm always available, I'll always matter. Those agreements may never have been spoken out loud, but we've spent years trying to honor them, and they're exhausting. Because every invisible contract eventually demands another payment. And usually that payment comes from you. And this is why emotionally responsible people often struggle with boundaries. Not because they don't know how to use the word no, but because no feels like they're breaking that contract. It feels like risking the entire relationship. The frightening part isn't disappointing someone. The frightening part is wondering, who will I be if people stop needing me? Now, that's not a boundary question. That's an identity question. One of the saddest things I've seen over the years is watching people spend decades earning something that healthy love was always willing to give them for free. Think about it. How exhausting is it to spend your entire life trying to earn what never needed to be earned, to prove what never needed proving, or to carry what never belonged to you? Now, that's not the signs of love. That's survival still trying to protect you. And this is where I want to introduce a phrase I hope you'll remember. And that's borrowed weight. Borrowed weight is every emotion you've picked up that was never yours to carry. Every problem you made your responsibility. Every disappointment that you've tried to fix. Every relationship you've tried to hold together by yourself. Now, borrowed weight may feel noble. It may even feel loving until you've carried it long enough to realize it's slowly crushing the person who's carrying it. Here's the truth I hope begins setting some people free today. You can care deeply without carrying everything. Those two things are not the same. Care says, I'll sit beside you. Carry says, I'll carry this for you. Like we said earlier, care creates connection. Carry often creates exhaustion. And eventually that exhaustion leads to resentment. Not because you stopped loving people, but because you've been trying to do a job that was never yours. So let me ask a question. Not one to answer quickly, but one to sit with. If no one needed your advice, your strength, your dependability, your ability to fix situations, or even your constant emotional availability, would you still believe you are worthy of love? I don't rush past that question, because somewhere underneath it, many people meet themselves for the very first time. If you've spent years measuring your worth by how much you carry, how do you begin putting that weight down without feeling guilty? How do you remain deeply compassionate without making everyone else's emotional world somehow your responsibility? In that space, that's where healing begins, not by carrying less, but by finally believing you were always worthy of love, even before you became useful. Now imagine trying to carry another adult on your back every day. At first, you'd notice the weight. Your muscles would ache. You'd wonder how much longer you could keep going. But after enough time, something strange would happen. You'd stop questioning the weight. You'd simply assume that the exhaustion was normal. And that's what emotional over-responsibility does. It becomes so familiar, you can't stop realizing you're carrying anyone at all. You simply just wake up tired and assume that's what love feels like. Well, it's not. It isn't. If you've been listening to this episode and quietly thinking, this sounds like me, I want you to hear something before we go any further. You're not broken. You're not weak. You're not loving people too much. You simply learned a way of loving that required you to disappear a little bit more every year. The problem isn't your heart. The problem is the belief that love requires self-abandonment, and those are not the same thing. One of the hardest truths emotionally responsive people have to learn is this: not every problem is an invitation. Sometimes it's simply just information. Someone you love is frustrated. That doesn't automatically make it your responsibility. Someone is disappointed. That doesn't automatically require your intervention. Someone is struggling. That doesn't always mean you're supposed to be the one to solve it. Healthy relationships allow people to experience their own emotions without immediately rescuing them from them. Now, that can feel almost wrong, especially if you spent years believing your value depended on keeping everyone emotionally okay. Because when you stop rescuing, you often feel guilty. Not because you were doing something wrong, but because your nervous system interprets healthy boundaries as emotional danger. Remember what we've learned together. Your nervous system doesn't immediately recognize healthy change. It often experiences change in general as a loss. And that's why putting the weight down can feel uncomfortable, even when it's exactly what you need. I've watched this happen with parents more times than I can count. A child comes home frustrated after a difficult day. The parent immediately begins trying to make the frustration disappear, offering solutions, calling teachers, fixing the situation, changing the environment. Not because they're controlling, but because loving parents hurt when their children hurt. And here's what I've learned. The hardest part of parenting isn't watching your child struggle. It's resisting the urge to remove every struggle. Because sometimes the discomfort you're trying to rescue them from is exactly what they're meant to grow through. Pain is not always the enemy. Sometimes pain is the classroom. I've seen the same pattern in marriages. One spouse has a hard week. The other quietly assumes responsibility for fixing the mood. So they choose to walk on eggshells, change their behavior, talk less, do more, without ever stopping to ask, is this actually my emotions to carry? The relationship slowly becomes organized around emotional management instead of emotional honesty. And eventually both people become lonely. One because they never feel trusted to carry their own emotions, and the other because they're exhausted from carrying two emotional lives instead of one. And this is where one distinction changed the way I understand relationships. There's a difference between borrowed weight and shared weight. Borrowed weight says, give it to me, I'll carry it instead of you. Shared weight says, I'll stay right here beside you while you carry what's yours. One removes responsibility. The other multiplies courage. One creates dependence, while the other allows for an opportunity for growth. Healthy love doesn't remove another person's strength. It believes in it. I think one of the greatest gifts you can give another human being is believing they're capable. That they're capable of grieving. They're capable of struggling. They're capable of healing. But they're capable of carrying what belongs to them. And every time you refuse to carry what belongs to someone else, you're making an act of trust. You're trusting that discomfort isn't destruction. That you're trusting that growth requires ownership. Trust that people you love are stronger than fear tells you they are. Here's something I don't want you to miss. Every time you carry what belongs to someone else, there's another message quietly being reinforced inside you. And that's my worth still depends on being needed. That's the hidden sentence. That's why putting the weight down feels so frightening. It isn't just changing your behavior. It's changing the identity you've been living inside. There is grief in becoming healthier. Real grief. Because healthier often means saying goodbye to a version of yourself that kept you safe for a very long time. Honor that version of you. Don't criticize it. Don't shame it. It worked incredibly hard. It protected you. It helped you survive environments where maybe you truly needed it. But survival isn't the same thing as living. Sometimes growth means thanking that version of yourself before gently letting it rest. And then something remarkable begins to happen. As you stop carrying everyone else's emotional world, you slowly rediscover your own preferences, dreams, your own voice, your own rest, your own joy. Many people have spent so much energy managing everyone else's lives, they've forgotten what it feels like to simply live their own. And that's one of the quiet gifts of healing. You don't become less compassionate. You finally become fully present in your own life. And here's the sentence I hope stays with you. Walk beside, don't carry. Healthy love doesn't ask, what can I carry? Healthy love asks, how can I walk beside you while you become stronger? That's what real support looks like. Not rescuing, controlling, or disappearing, but walking beside someone while believing they are capable of carrying what belongs to them. One of the strongest people you'll ever meet isn't the person who carries everyone. It's the person who quietly communicates, I believe you're stronger than this moment. Think about your own life. The people who changed you the most probably weren't the ones who carried you. They were the ones who stayed beside you long enough for you to discover you could carry yourself. So what does it actually look like in everyday life? How do you care deeply without slipping back into carrying? How do you remain compassionate without making everyone else's emotional world your responsibility? Because in the final part of today's episode, I want you to leave with a simple practice that has changed the way I counsel, the way I lead, and the way I love. Not a strategy for caring less, but a way of loving that is healthier for both you and the people you care about. Now, if you've stayed with me through today's episode, I hope one thing has become clear. The goal is not to care less. The goal isn't to become emotionally detached. The goal isn't to stop showing compassion. The goal is to become someone who can love deeply without disappearing in the process. Because real love doesn't require you to lose yourself. It requires you to bring your whole self into the relationship. One of the greatest lies emotionally responsible people quietly believe is this: if I stop carrying everyone else, I'll become selfish. I hear that fear all the time. If I stop fixing everything, if I stop saying yes, if I stop making everyone happy, won't I become cold? The answer is no. Healthy boundaries don't make you less loving. They make your love more honest. Because love that depends on self-abandonment isn't sustainable. Eventually, it becomes exhaustion pretending to be kindness. I want to give you one simple practice, not another checklist, not another complicated strategy, just one question. The next time someone you love is struggling, Before you rush in, before you solve, apologize, carry, I want you to simply just pause and ask yourself, what belongs to me and what belongs to them? Now, that question changes everything because healthy relationship has two emotional worlds, yours and theirs. Love connects them. It doesn't confuse them. Sometimes what belongs to you is simple. Maybe it's listening, encouragement, an apology, just presence, keeping your word, owning when something is your mistake, being emotionally available. Those things belong to you. But another person's disappointment doesn't. Somebody else's anxiety, not yours. Another person's choices, not yours. You can influence those things. You can care about those things. You can pray for those things. But you can't own them. And the moment you start trying, you begin carrying borrowed weight again. Now, one of the most freeing discoveries I've ever made personally, and one I've watched transform clients over years, is realizing that love and control are not the same thing. Sometimes we try to control because we care. We try to manage or rescue or overfunction. We try to absorb or anticipate. Not because we're manipulative, but because we're afraid. We're afraid that the people in our lives, or the people that we love, that they'll hurt or they'll fail, or maybe they'll leave or think less of us. But here's the difficult truth. Control rarely creates closeness. More times it creates distance. Because people feel safest around those who trust them, not those who are quietly trying to manage them. I've seen marriages change when one spouse stopped trying to regulate the other one's emotions. I've seen parents change their relationship with their teenage children by replacing lectures with curiosity. I've seen leaders become more respected after learning they didn't have to carry every problem in the organization. Now, what changed in those? Wasn't their compassion, it was their trust. They began believing other people were capable. And when you communicate, I believe you can carry this, you're giving someone one of the greatest gifts possible, and that's confidence. And that confidence eventually turns into self-esteem. Think back over this season. We've talked about replaying conversations, repairing after you overreact, words you regret, people pushing your buttons, maybe defensiveness and taking things personally, feeling responsible for everyone else's emotions. At first, those sounded like different struggles, but underneath, they've all been pointing toward one question. Who am I when I stop living in fear? That's really what we've been exploring, because fear reacts, it assumes, it carries. Fear performs and it protects. But love listens, stays curious and repairs, tells the truth. It walks beside, it doesn't carry. Maybe that's what emotional maturity really is. Not becoming harder, but not becoming more independent or less emotional. Maybe emotional maturity is simply becoming secure enough that you no longer have to earn your place in the relationships you value most. You no longer have to prove your worth by fixing or rescuing or carrying. You begin believing something much healthier, that your value has never depended on how much emotional weight that you could hold. One day, someone you love is going to be disappointed. Someone's going to be frustrated. And someone will struggle. And your old identity will whisper, fix it, carry it, don't let them feel this. But if you've been walking through this season with me, I hope another voice has started becoming stronger, quieter, more steady voice. One that simply says, walk beside them. Believe that they're capable and stay present. Carry what's yours. That voice is emotional freedom. So this week, I want you to practice one sentence. Whenever you feel yourself taking ownership of someone else's emotional world, simply ask, is this mine to carry? If the answer is yes, carry it with courage. If the answer is no, walk beside them with compassion. That single question may change every important relationship in your life. Not because you'll become less loving, but because you'll finally become free to love without fear. Now, if today's episode resonated with you, I'd encourage you to spend some time reflecting on the relationships where you've been carrying borrowed weight. Awareness is always the first step, but practice is where lasting change is created. So if you're ready to continue to work, you can visit pauseandrespond.com, pick up some of the workbooks, the text, different episodes of the podcast are on there. Coaching opportunities are available on there for you to check out and see if that helps you on your journey. And if someone came to mind while you were listening today, share this episode with them. Not because they need fixing, but because they may have spent their whole life believing they had to earn the love they've been longing for. This is Pause and Respond. We're not trying to love less. We're learning to love wisely. Because the healthiest relationships aren't built by people who carry each other. They're built by people who walk beside one another with courage, compassion, and trust. Until next time, less reaction, more choice.